続きまして、ハーバード大学のジョセフ・ナイ先生よりご講演いただきます。ナイ先生は、アメリカ国際政治学の重鎮の一人で、パワーと相互依存、ソフトパワー、スマートパワーなど、斬新な概念を数多く生み出してこられました。また、歴代のアメリカ民主党政権で、国防次官補などの要職を務められました。さらに、知日派の国際政治学者として、日米関係に関するさまざまな政策提言をされています。演題は、The US, China and Japan です。それでは、ナイ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back at this symposium of Tokyo International University. And I think the topic of Japan in the world is extremely important, but I think even more than in prior years, the world has become more complicated. So it makes our situation that much more difficult. I'm going to focus not on the whole world, but on three major components: Japan, China, and the US. And I think reason for doing that is my belief that the key strategic issue for Japan and for the US is the rise of Chinese power. Some analysts believe that China will seek a form of hegemony in East Asia, and that will lead to conflict. Unlike Europe after 1945, East Asia never came fully to terms with the 1930s, and the Cold War divisions made that even more difficult to reconcile or overcome. Now, President Trump has launched a trade war with China and negotiations with Japan which take aim at Japan's trade surplus. While the recent announcement of bilateral talks postpones Trump's threat of auto tariffs against Japan, critics worry that Trump may push Japan closer to China. Indeed, many in the press interpret Prime Minister Abe's visit to Beijing, the current visit, as part of that process of readjustment from the United States toward China. Now, to put that in a larger historical context, the balance of power between China and Japan has shifted markedly over recent decades. In 2010, China's economy passed Japan's in total size, as measured in dollars or at exchange rates, though it remains far behind Japan in per capita income. And lest you say, well, that doesn't matter, per capita income is not so important, as someone who just came from Beijing yesterday and had to worry about whether I could breathe the air and drink the water, to come to a city like Tokyo, where I can breathe the air and drink the water, is a indication that per capita income does indeed matter. But in any case, the point is that it wasn't very long ago that there was a feeling that Japan was going to be a threat and was going to be the rising hegemon of East Asia, not China. In fact, many Americans wrote books that predicted a Japanese-led Pacific bloc that would exclude the United States, and even an eventual war between Japan and the United States. The head of Stratfor wrote a book called The Coming War with Japan. I thought it was nonsense at the time, and it has proven to be nonsense, but it's worth remembering that perceptions change over time. In any case, during the Clinton administration, the U.S. reaffirmed its security alliance with Japan, but at the same time, we accepted the rise of China, and we supported China's admission to the World Trade Organization. We had a dual purpose or dual part strategy toward East Asia, which might be called integrate but hedge. Integrate meant we felt that the rise of Chinese economic power was inevitable, and it was not going to be possible to stop it. The suggestions of trying to contain China struck us as impractical. At the same time, we couldn't be sure how China would behave as it became more powerful, as its economy grew. And that was the reason that we approached our Japanese friends and colleagues and said, let's reinforce the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty as a hedge, just to be safe in case China misbehaves and becomes a bully as its strength grows. Now, it's worth remembering again how perceptions change. In the early 1990s, many observers, both in the U.S. and in Japan, believed that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was obsolete, that it was a relic of the Cold War. And now that the Cold War is over, we should drop the treaty. And in Japan, there was a group who said that Japan should place its security in the hands of the United Nations. It should become internationalized, and that was the secret for the post-Cold War world. And in the United States, there were many people who were saying in the early days of the Clinton administration that no, Japan was the problem, and we certainly didn't want to strengthen an alliance with Japan. There was an American senator named Paul Tsongas who ran for president in 1992, and his slogan was, "The Cold War is over and Japan has won." And that's because the view was that Japan was going to defeat the U.S. economically. Now, in the early days of the Clinton administration, there was a certain amount of Japan bashing, particularly over trade policy. But fortunately, the Clinton administration came to perceive the fact that Japan and the U.S. had more important long-term interests. And we had 2 years of negotiations before we had the declaration signed by Prime Minister Hashimoto and President Clinton in Tokyo in 1996 that proclaimed that the U.S.-Japan alliance was not an obsolete relic of the Cold War, but instead would be the bedrock of stability for post-Cold War Asia. Now, there were still deep levels of malaise between our two countries, and it wasn't expressed openly, but I remember that during that period in the early 90s, when I was involved in renegotiating the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty to try to save it from this view that it was obsolete, I was sometimes approached by my Japanese counterparts, not while we were bargaining across the table in the Gaimasho, but when we were having a drink afterwards, and they would say, "Look, China's growing so fast and so strong, aren't you going to desert us and orient yourself toward China? In other words, there was a fear in Japan at that time that the growth of Chinese economic strength would lead to a reorientation of American foreign policy toward China and away from Japan. I used to say to my Japanese counterparts and friends, no, I didn't think that was likely for two very important reasons. One was that the US and Japan were both democracies and able to communicate with each other openly and publicly, and China was not a democracy. And the other was that I did not think that Japan posed a threat, and it was unclear whether in the future China might pose a threat. So we were able to get agreement on reaffirmation of the US-Japan Security Treaty, which led to the Clinton-Hashimoto Declaration. But the anxieties that were expressed over drinks late at night are not surprising, because when you have an alliance in which the defense capabilities of the two allies are not symmetrical, that's bound to create anxiety in the more dependent ally. Over the years, some Japanese intellectuals and analysts have argued that Japan should become, in quotes, a normal country with a full panoply of military capabilities. Some have even suggested that Japan drop its anti-nuclear principles and develop nuclear weapons. But such measures would actually raise more problems than they would resolve. Even if Japan took steps to become a normal country, whatever that ambiguous term means, it would still not make Japan equal to the power of the United States or China. In fact, the way I think about it is that if normal country means interpreting the Constitution to allow Japan to have a right of collective self-defense, which Prime Minister Abe has already accomplished, then I agree with it. But if normal country means developing nuclear weapons, then I think it would be a mistake. So much depends on how you interpret this. But the underlying anxieties were certainly there 20 years ago, and obviously they remain. Today, however, the anxieties in the alliance are greater because of a new set of worries that have been added on to what I might call the traditional worries that grew out of the asymmetry of the size of the two allies that I encountered when I was negotiating this in the 1990s. And the new set of worries today about American abandonment, as Komura-san said, grow out of President Trump's American first orientation, his protectionist policies, and his questioning of the value of forward-based U.S. military presence. That's a new set of risks to the alliance. Trump's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a blow to Japan. But Japan, I think, handled it well. Indeed, Prime Minister Abe has skillfully played to Trump's ego to deflect conflict, and he's been able to handle Trump better than most other allied leaders have. But problems still remain. The Trump administration's imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs against Japan on national security grounds surprised Prime Minister Abe and raised anxieties in Tokyo. Trump administration has also brought back old themes about alliance burden sharing. Trump has made headlines by suggesting, not just in Asia, but in Europe as well, that U.S. allies should do more to defend themselves, and by openly questioning the value of forward deployed American forces. That has led people to worry then about whether there'll be a new pressure on Japan to hedge its bets and to edge towards China. But I think that is unlikely at this stage. While Japan may properly and sensibly explore such options of improving its relations with China, and I hope the Abe visit to Beijing will indeed improve relations, I can't imagine a real old-fashioned reversal of alliances, because Japan does not want to be dominated by China. So in that sense, maintaining the American alliance remains the best option for Japan, unless Trump goes much further. Thus far, the U.S.-Japan alliance remains remarkably strong. Prime Minister Abe reached out early to President-elect Trump, meeting him first in the Trump Tower in New York in 2016, and then subsequently during visits to Washington and Mar-a-Lago. And because of that Abe-Trump personal relationship, that allowed the Pentagon and the State Department and the parts of the bureaucracy which are deep believers in the U.S.-Japan alliance to work closely together. So with that protection from the top, it was possible to see good progress in the implementation of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, despite some of the anxieties and frictions at the rhetorical level. Now, in addition to that, in the first year of the Trump administration, North Korea helped to focus the alliance's attention and provided an opportunity for President Trump to assure Japan that the United States was behind Japan 100%. And those were the words that Trump used. And Abe and Trump both supported a policy of maximum pressure, which was designed to create and sustain sanctions on North Korea, which would be built around the international United Nations sanctions, and which would provide incentives for North Korea to denuclearize. In that sense, the U.S. and Japan in the first year of the Trump administration were quite close. Meanwhile, progress was made on the ground. Japan announced a major new investment in ballistic missile defense and cooperated in joint development with the United States. But that all became somewhat shaky after Trump's surprising reversal in attitude toward Kim Jong-un after their Singapore summit in June. And that raised Japanese concerns about a possible American deal between Kim and Trump, which might ignore the interests of Japan, which might focus solely on intercontinental missiles and ignore, for example, the medium-range missiles that could reach Japan. So there was an anxiety that was introduced into the relationship which hadn't been there in the first year, and that still continues. Now, if one looks back at Washington and asks, is there likely to be a Trump Kim deal, most analysts that I know who look at North Korea closely, say no. That Trump likes to flatter himself that he has produced some sort of change in North Korean policy because of his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un. But the North Korean analysts that I know and respect say, look, don't forget that Kim Jong-un is a man who shot his uncle and poisoned his brother, and who cares very much about maintaining the legitimacy of the Kim dynasty, and that nuclear weapons are part of that. The idea that he would tell Trump that he'll get rid of them is quite plausible. He's lied before. The idea that he will actually get rid of them and do a deal with Trump is quite low. However, it may lead to a situation where the prospects of war on the peninsula are reduced, and that's a good thing. So it might turn out that the fears that were aroused after Singapore, that the Korean situation would provide a point of division in the U.S.-Japan alliance, I think are probably less alarming than they first appeared. But we haven't seen the end of this story yet. The other area of concern is Trump's rhetoric about burden sharing. While its defense expenditure, Japan's defense expenditure, is only about 1% of its gross domestic product, and Trump has complained to the Europeans that they have to bring their defense expenditure above 2%, it is worth remembering that Japan contributes significant host nation support to the presence of American troops in Japan. And that's extremely important because the presence of those American troops provides a concrete linkage between the American nuclear guarantee and Japan's security. One cannot imagine North Korea, China, or anyone lobbing weapons into Japan without killing Americans. In other words, the Americans will be involved, and the troops that are here are the guarantee. So in that sense, Japan's investment in host-nation support is very important. And the latest figures that I've seen are that Japan budgeted 197 billion yen for cost sharing last year, 226 billion yen for the realignment of U.S. forces, and 266 billion yen for various types of community support, among other alliance-related expenditures. Or another way of putting that is the Japanese government pays nearly 3/4 of the costs of supporting U.S. forces in Japan. I would argue that that's a very good investment for Japan and for the U.S., and we have to hope that we can persuade President Trump of that, and that he will focus on the host nation support and not on the 1% of GDP number. But we can't be sure. We don't ever feel sure about how President Trump will interpret things. So as the Clinton administration recognized 25 years ago, the rise of China created a three-nation balance of power in East Asia. Our policy strategy was not containment of China. It wasn't like the Cold War, where we had no trade or social relations with the Soviet Union. Our policy was to engage China, but to work closely with Japan to shape the environment in which China's power grew, so that if China misused its power or tried to be a bully, it would face U.S. and Japan working effectively together. And that would give China incentives to behave more reasonably. And that, of course, means that the U.S.-Japan alliance remains extremely important. Komura-san mentioned the report that Richard Armitage and I released in Washington earlier this month. And the title of this report tells you the answer that we reached. It's called More Important Than Ever. And what we concluded from the study group that looked at this situation, and I will read you a few sentences from the report, is Japan is the most capable U.S. ally in the most important part of the world. If one looks at the progress we've made over the last 5 years, we've concluded new defense guidelines, established coordination mechanisms, jointly developed the Block 2A ballistic missile interceptor, and Japan has renovated its domestic security legislation, enabling the exercise of collective self-defense. So there have been significant improvements and progress in the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. But there's more to be done. The types of threats which I mentioned to you loom on the horizon, and we have to make sure that we are able to deal with them. And those threats come both from misperceptions in Washington, but also from the problems that arise from China and North Korea. So what we concluded in our report is that there's much that we can still do to strengthen this alliance. And just to read you a few sentences, there's much the U.S. and Japan can do in the years ahead. We suggest 10 specific initiatives which fall into several categories. To strengthen bilateral economic ties, we recommend recommitting to an open trade and investment regime. To deepen operational coordination, we recommend operating from combined bases, establishing a combined joint task force, creating a Japanese Joint Operations Command, and conducting combined contingency planning. To advance joint technology development, we recommend co-developing defense equipment and expanding high technology cooperation. And finally, to expand cooperation with regional partners, we recommend reinvigorating trilateral security cooperation with Korea, launching a regional infrastructure fund, and forging a broader regional economic strategy. Those are spelled out in more detail in the report, but as I said, the secret to what we concluded is given away by the title. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty is more important than ever. Thank you.
ナイ先生、ありがとうございました。続きまして、岡本幸夫先生よりご講演をいただきます。岡本先生は元外交官、現在は外交評論家として広くご活躍されています。また、マサチューセッツ工科大学国際研究センターシニアフェローとして、教育・研究分野にも深く携わっていらっしゃいます。演題は、アジアの安全保障危機と日本です。岡本先生、よろしくお願いいたします。